Welcome. I'm Christa Steele, CEO, Board Director, and Vice Chair of our NACD Northern California chapter. Today I'm here with Derek Zaba, Co-Chair of Shareholder Activism Practice at Sidley. Welcome, Derek.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Today marks a monumental day for directors and for shareholder activism. Can you walk us through and explain some of these changes with this new SEC rule that will have a direct impact on our directors about the Universal Proxy Rule?
Sure. No, happy to do so. So the Universal Proxy Rule was adopted in late last year and came into effect on September 1st, 2022. So for any shareholder meeting that occurs on or after that date, it is required to have a universal proxy card. And what that is, and let me just step back and talk a little bit about what that really is. And at its core, it's a change in the voting mechanism and the way the mechanics work for voting in a contested election. So a situation where an investor has proposed an alternative slate of directors. So let me just step back and talk about the way things were, and then we can talk about the way things are headed, or actually are here now. In the old days, not too long ago, if an activist ran a contest, there would be a separate voting card for the activist nominees versus the company nominees. So as an example, if the activist had 3 nominees and the company had 3 nominees, you'd have 2 separate voting cards. You'd have the company voting card and you'd have the activist voting card. And for all practical purposes, without going through a whole lot of gymnastics that institutional investors do not go through, you could only vote one card or the other. So your choice was 0, 1, 2, 3 from the company slate or 0, 1, 2, or 3 from the activist slate, but you couldn't easily or practically speaking mix or match. Now, in the universal proxy world, all 6 nominees are put onto the same ballot, and you can simply choose which of these 6 are, or which of 3 of these 6 are the ones that you want to have on the board. So it's a very straightforward, simple mechanical change, but it has a lot of consequences that all in all are a net positive for activists and a net negative for directors and corporate America.
Yeah, wow. That is a mouthful, and what a dramatic change.
It is a substantial change.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is going to ignite more activism. I saw somewhere where dry powder sitting on the sidelines by activist groups right now is staggering $200 billion sitting on the sidelines. So do you think that there's going to be any specific industries that are going to be targeted more than another?
Yeah, I think that's probably the case. It's probably less to do with universal proxy. I think there's certainly going to be more activism with universal proxy. The Universal Proxy Rule, and it's going to be easier for activists. I think there are going to be more settlements up front, so we can talk about that in a little more detail. But in terms of your question about where they're going to be hitting, I think it's mostly driven by market dynamics and valuations, and certainly, and we're talking, with the Northern California chapter of NACD, given what's happened to technology companies and particular software companies within technology with valuations coming down so much, activists are really, at this present time, really going after those types of companies. So they've certainly migrated. Even people we haven't traditionally seen in software are really looking at and executing campaigns. So that is certainly occurring, but more to do with the market dynamics than necessarily universal proxy at this point.
And what's going to be the impact on public company directors?
Yeah, I think there's a few different things. Let me talk a little bit about kind of the impact on proxy contests, as that leads to kind of what the real impact is for the individuals that are your members and our public company directors. But I think there's a couple of things to understand about the way this works and the implications. The first is the way institutional investors and proxy advisors vote in these contested elections. It's really a 2-step process, and that is very true for the proxy advisors, because as opposed to investors, they have to publish what their criteria are and how they think about recommending in these types of situations. So particularly thinking about ISS and Glass Lewis. Now, both of them have a 2-step process. The first thing you have to do is you have to evaluate the activist arguments and the company arguments and figure out, well, does the activist have a credible case for change or not? And if they don't, it ends there and the company is supported. It's only if they have a credible case for change that you actually go to the next step, which is, well, if that's the case, then let's look at the directors on each card and figure out who are the best people to have in place to help facilitate that change. And one of my fears is that investors, particularly, but also the proxy advisors, will kind of skip that first step and will say, won't as much evaluate the arguments of the activists, but rather slip right to, well, let's just pick the best directors as we see from their resumes on paper. let's just pick the ones we think that would be best on the board and be done with it. And that's an easy way to kind of shortcut through the activist arguments. And my concern is that the people that are making decisions, and I've been trying to tell everybody in this world that will listen that this is my concern, is that a director that is elected from an activist slate is not the same. They come with a bit of a mandate. The boardroom dynamics are a bit different. And so it's not just saying, what are their resumes, and let's put the three best people. If somebody from the activist slate ends up on the board, the activist is going to claim a mandate. Often the person in the boardroom claims a mandate that is in line with the activist's objectives. And so it's a very more complicated than simply looking at their resumes. And my hope is, and ISS and Glass Lewis have both stated that they will keep their two-stage process, but there's entirely possible that we end up in a situation where some activist nominees get elected. The majority of shareholders weren't necessarily supporting the activist slates or the activist ideas. They were voting based on the resumes of the directors, and the activist and the director come in and claim a mandate from the majority of shareholders, which just simply isn't the case. And so we want to make sure that when investors are making their choices, that they fully understand the implications of what happens if an activist nominee gets in court.
Yeah, and Gensler, chairman of the SEC, came out and said this is an important aspect of shareholder democracy. Do you think that we're going to see more shareholders continue to lean into ISS and Glass Lewis recommendations because of this added component now? I mean, they're not going to want to even try to pick who the best slate's going to be. They're going to lean into what the recommendations are. So you think we're going to see shareholder democracy, or what? How does that impact?
And I think, it's having everybody on one ballot. It sounds like very shareholder friendly, shareholder democracy, but the implications here are just much bigger and much more nuanced. And so it's important that everybody understands that. I do think it will be a much more difficult decision for ISS and Glass Lewis. It'll be more complicated for them and for investors, because not only do they have to pick which side, and as they did in the past when ISS and Glass Lewis were recommending, they would recommend who to vote for. They didn't necessarily, and certainly in normal director elections, have to say who to take off, right? And now they actually have to make that choice, which is a much more difficult, complex choice. ISS has specifically come out with guidance that says that they might need to have multiple meetings with companies and speak to all of the directors that they're considering in greater detail, because they're going to have those conversations before they can make such a fine decision as to who to keep on, and who to keep off. And the truth is this, we're talking a lot about what happens downstream on the ballots and in a proxy contest. If you get that far, very few campaigns actually get that far, right? There are 25, 30 proxy contests a year that actually go to a vote. And so we're talking about the universal ballot being used in a couple of dozen situations. But the problem is upstream. The problem is upstream because there are several hundred activist campaigns a year, and activists are going to use this and their belief of being more successful at the ballot box and their confidence in that, and frankly, their willingness, as I believe they will, nominate more directors than is justified in any given situation, as additional leverage in negotiations. And so that is, I think, is where the real concerns are. It's if there are some impact downstream and that activists are a bit more successful because of this mechanic, and investors are kind of voting but not fully appreciating some of the impacts of their vote, that is a couple dozen companies. But in terms of the negotiation that happens upstream with activists, which is a couple hundred companies a year, I think that the activists are going to put forth settlements that are less reasonable. They're going to take actions that are more aggressive in order to get leverage, in order to drive settlements that are more in their favor. And that's, I think, the real concern, and the real impact on the companies are those companies that are approached by activists, not the couple dozen that actually go to a vote.
Yeah, I mean, that was a question I had is, do you really think that we're going to see as many settlements, or are we going to go all the way to the mat because of the potential leverage that this change has?
Yeah, and we'll have to see. I think it is unquestionable that activists will be demanding more. It's also unquestionable, certainly next 2 years, but probably longer, that there's more uncertainty as to outcomes as we figure this out. And so those kind of cut across each other, and whether there's going to be a settlement. The more uncertainty there is, the more likely that parties are, willing to settle. if you can get somewhere in the middle. So I don't know where we're going to end up as far as more settlements or less, but I do know that activists are going to be driving for more in this new environment.
As we directors start to think about how this is going to impact us in the boardroom, I imagine we probably need to think through the lens of an activist mindset. Is there any minimum share requirement for activists to do this?
No, and I think that's one of the points we were, I think there were only two law firms that wrote comment letters to the SEC when this rule was being developed. One was us and one was our colleagues on the other side of the aisle with number one share is Olshan, who represents a vast majority of activists. Mm-hmm. And one of the concerns we raised is that in addition to traditional shareholder activism and the impact it'll have, this is essentially a proxy contest on steroids for those that are trying to achieve more ESG or social or shareholder proposal type objectives. Proxy access was a method that required 3% for 3 years is what the market settled on in order to put a director candidate up for what was expected to be a non-control and non-activist type of position. So more shareholder proposal equivalents, but for director elections. And now we have a methodology that is geared towards traditional shareholder activism, but those folks that could look at proxy access and say that was too hard to get to 3% for 3 years, I need one share for 1 minute. And now I can nominate one director and for the same purpose that I would have used proxy access for. So in that sense, for that piece of the puzzle, this eviscerates the need for proxy access really and brings down the hurdles for somebody wanting to use that type of mechanism.
Activists put together a list of reasons why they're putting forth a slate. Can you talk about what those common reasons are and what new reasons may come about and how directors could combat those with your tabletop exercises that Sidley does?
Sure, and yes, and just the tabletop exercises, and I think those are mock exercises that we do with C-suites and directors that kind of take them through a proxy contest. And I will say it is always more fun to go through a proxy contest and a tabletop exercise than it is the real thing.
Sure, I'm sure. I can
just guarantee it's and you can usually do them with a glass of wine and a nice relaxing setting, so we can have some fun with it. But in terms of your question about what do activists ask for? I think it's important to just characterize them into really two buckets. The first is the economic set of objectives. So what are the things the activist really wants related to strategy, financials, related to changing CEO, cutting cost, all those types of issues are part of their core economic thesis. And coupled with that is always a ESG board composition type of argument, which is really more about governance, oversight, really trying to impugn not only the capabilities, but also the incentives and drive home to shareholders that boards aren't aligned with shareholders because they have governance that looks like it's from the 1980s. And now we're getting into this whole separate topic of using E&S for that same objective. And I think what's going to happen here with Universal Proxy is you're going to have more detailed criticisms and more specific criticisms about individual directors, because it's going to change from a issue versus issue type of contest. The activists have their platform, the company has that platform, and you need to choose, and going to migrate more towards a director by director type of contest. These are the directors with the skills you need. These are the directors with the skills that are not needed or are lesser quality than somebody we have with the same skill set. And that's why you need to go with these directors. If you look at the presentations that are put forth to ISS and the investors that for those contests that actually do go deep, they have 70 pages, pretend for this example. The discussion about the individual directors is typically in the last section, a handful of pages, whereas the rest of it is all about the company, the business, the activist platform, all of that. And so I think you'll see much more focus on those directors, and not only in the written materials and the presentations, but also in the engagements. As I said, ISS said we might have to have multiple meetings. You're going to have directors that are going to have multiple meetings, take up more time, talk to more investors, because if they're choosing individual directors and have to do it in this way because everybody's on the same ballot, so they have to choose who to put on and to put who to take off, then it's going to take more time and effort. And so we'll certainly see more arguments and more airtime dedicated to individuals' track record, and these will contests will just become more personal.
Yeah. as we've moved, there's such a push for stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder capitalism, and a move away from all of the financial measurements. Do you see tying it into director selection, more focus on directors with a diverse background and skill set that accompanies and helps define better ESG measurements for corporations?
Yeah, I think that's certainly a trend, and you see the kind of ESG-ing of the world, and that is not activism is not immune. Is actually one place that's affected pretty heavily by that change in perspectives. So you'll see more of that, and I think for when kind of think about the intersection with universal proxy, a lot of ESG type issues can be framed in terms of oversight. And so if there's an ESG issue with the board or with the company, you can oftentimes and many times just characterize it or as a failure of oversight. And so we'll see more tied into board oversight like that. I also think it's very important, just thinking more broadly about individual directors and skill sets, that if you are a director and you're thinking about the boards you're on, you're thinking about your portfolio of companies you have an offer to join another board, you really should be able to in convincingly articulate why your skill set, why your experience is relevant to this company, is relevant to its current strategy, is relevant to the strategy that it's going towards. And in some cases, and you brought this up before, think like an activist, what are the arguments an activist could make? And so an activist could make, a variety of arguments. In many cases, the company has thought about those types of issues, thought about a spinoff and decided now's not the right time, or it's not a good idea for various reasons. But having somebody on the board that can articulate and understand and has been through a spinoff and has that type of experience can be very helpful in coming to that conclusion and making sure that an activist doesn't present that argument, or that other shareholders know that the board has the skill set to evaluate such a weighty decision as a spinoff. And so thinking about the types of people that an activist would put on the board is also a part of the way a company and directors should think about whether to join a board or whether to invite another director to the board.
Director succession sounds like it's going to become more and more prevalent. For a long time, it's been very hard to change out directors or to motivate long tenured directors to retire. And now with this change, it almost seems like that's part of the change, is that it's going to force corporations to really take a strong look and say, do we have the right mix in the boardroom, versus having the majority of the board, maybe long tenured board directors, but that have been out of practice and outside of operating roles for 15 plus years. Do you think that that's going to be more prevalent and be a bigger discussion?
I think absolutely that's the case. And if I recall correctly, I think ISS's guidance talked about the weakest director or the weaker directors. Mm-hmm. So you're going to have, now you're in a situation where if there is a proxy contest, and not only are they talking about, how good their candidates are, and they used to talk a bit about the other candidates, but now they have specifically to go into a lot greater detail about why to take the people off. And if you are a director that is quote unquote the weakest for a variety of reasons, or frankly, just a skill set doesn't match what the company needs at this stage, you're a lot more in personal jeopardy of getting, having that brought in front of shareholders. So I think that this certainly will, I think, increase the conversations about, board succession and board composition and the processes relating thereto. This is certainly, it's hard, it seems like the way of the world is that more and more just keeps getting loaded onto the various committees, and sometimes new committees are formed. But I do think that Nom and Gov is going to be taking more time thinking about, director composition and succession. And that's not true for every company. Some companies already spend a good deal of time and are very thoughtful about it. But I think that's going to be a trend that is going to be here, is that more of these committees are going to have to spend a lot more time planning it out and thinking more. And for larger companies or even mid-sized companies, it may not be, too difficult to do, but for smaller companies where resources are limited and time is limited, and you have smaller boards, it's tough to prioritize. And so, but this is one thing I think, given the rule change and given what's going to happen in activism, this is worth spending a bit more time than you did in the past.
Yeah, how many best practices for on the disclosure side for board matrix and what should be disclosed? I mean, I think now it's becoming more and more. We got to put more out there in the public domain on the mix and skill set. How deep and detailed does that need to be now? Can it be a check the box kind of thing, or does it need to be more detailed?
I think it's I check the box is fine. I think you also you'll get into a bit of it in the director biographies and justifications for putting them on the board, but those don't have to be tied one to one to the skill set. But I think you should think long and hard about the skills that you are actually putting forth as the most necessary for your board. I think the best set of skills are skills that are very well thought out, not generic. Are specific to your industry, ideally specific to your company, and most importantly is to be able to articulate why those skill sets are listed in the matrix. And part of this whole conversation, we talked about ESG a little bit, but also kind of the board skills matrix and board composition, is communicating this to large institutional investors and proxy advisory firms. And so not only is it having this information out there, but it's also trying to get those meetings, trying to have those discussions, trying to get one-on-one or group meetings with these, proxy governance teams to explain these types of things. And I think that's another a suggestion for individual directors is developing relationships and having those conversations, knowing who they are, is helpful and is valuable, even if you do it for one company, because you might face another challenge in another company. And now it's more about you than it is about the company, given the change in the proxy, in the Universal Proxy Rules. And so I think there'll be a greater demand for individual directors to have those types of conversations for this reason. But I also think it's a good thing just more generally for directors to be having those, those types of conversations directly with the large governance people.
That's good, because a lot of management teams try, a lot of them don't include the board directors. They'll try to have that dialogue and that relationship directly. But it's becoming more and more prevalent where directors are more engaged in the discussions. And so as you think about when you have your tabletops, do you talk about who's on the board and which directors or for the company to think about or the boards to think about that should be the representatives at these meetings? I mean, do you get into that level of detail?
Yeah, and we can, and all of these are a little bit customized, so it really depends on the companies, and that's true with the engagement. So it's certainly more director involvement is the trend, and I think that's the right answer in a lot of cases. But not every case do you need to have a director, and it does make sense for IR for the C-suite to be the primary point of contact. But I do think the opportunities and the need for directors to engage, particularly if there's any type of thorny issue that's at all related to the board, it is just higher. But to your question about, yes, I think we do think long and hard about who should engage, why they should engage, how often they should engage. That is a big piece of the puzzle, and we certainly do address it in a lot of the tabletops.
Excellent. You have a Universal Proxy Card Resource Center. Can you talk a little about that?
Sure. That's something we launched the day before the Universal Proxy Card rule became effective. And what we're trying to do is really aggregate all the information that market participants, directors, C-suite, other advisors might need to really understand the rule. And so we've aggregated not only the rule and other official posts, but also various insights from ourselves, from other market participants, from investors, proxy advisory firms. So all those whose perspectives on this issue really matter and drive the discussion, try to put them in a place so that people have the ability to go to one place and actually see how the world is thinking about this and what impact it'll really have on them.
Great. And for directors that are watching this right now and reading all of this, and as they go back into their boardrooms this fall, and this becomes more of a bigger topic as activists become more active, what should they be doing? I mean, for me, I'm in the middle of getting my cybersecurity certification, and I've got different certifications, but I mean, how do we best defend ourselves going forward? Do you encourage us to continue to get the NACD director certification and cyber certifications and yada, 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 or are these good things that we should be doing right now?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. That's absolutely the case. So this is going to be more about director skill sets and background and match between company. And so the more you can demonstrate that, the more you have those skill sets, the more you can demonstrate continuing education. All of those are excellent things to do. I think for those directors who are, who feel like they're facing an imminent activist challenge, getting out ahead of it this fall is helpful in making sure you're prepared. For those that those companies, which are generally not my clients because they don't need help if it activist doesn't show up, the stock price is up and to the right. But if things are going good for the company now, I think the focus is really more on NomGov and the committee and thinking about how are you doing? Are you thinking about board composition and success, director succession the right way? How should it evolve? So I think that regardless of, for the individual directors, for companies that are maybe more at risk, for those who are less at risk, there's something to do across the board to prepare yourselves a little bit better for this new environment that we're in.
Excellent. Well, any last closing thoughts?
I think I just echo, this is a big change, and it is what appears to be a minor change in voting mechanics, but I think has a lot of nuance and will be a very significant impact in a lot of ways. And I've mentioned a number of them that I believe will come to fruition. I'm sure 12 months from now, 24 months from now, we'll find out that there were a few more that were really significant. So we'll see how this all evolves over the next 6, 12 months, and then come back and talk about it again and what lessons learned and the things that we need to do to prepare for the next year.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for the partnership that Sidley has with NACD. It's a real pleasure, and all of your wise words of wisdom right now are super relevant. So thank you so much.
For us as well, it's a great partnership. Thank you, Christa.